Hello there, my name is Barry McConnell. I have a little bit of experience with eels and eel angling, and I'm going to make a short video now to tell you about trials I've been doing with lip hooking eels, mainly using a twig, but I'm also going to show you the semi-bolt rig. The first trials I did were with a small twig. This one is only 1mm diameter carbon rod and 2.5 inches long. It was very effective with small-mouthed eels and small baits, but it wasn't quite 100%, so it's not good enough. We want 100%, we don't want to kill a single eel. It was not as effective with wide-mouthed eels and bigger baits, so we do not recommend a twig this short. After further trials, I can now recommend this clear acrylic rod. It is 100mm long and it's got a 3mm diameter. It's the length that's critical more than the diameter, because if I show you against this wooden eel's mouth, the eel can take the bait into its mouth at the front and take that down through the corner of its mouth. The twig will be butted up to the corner of the mouth and it can't get around the angle and to go down its throat. It's too long. And the same, I'll show it against this taxidermy eel. You can see that such a large twig will not get around the angle from the corner of its mouth to go down its throat. Whereas this smaller twig that we did the original trials with, it was too easy to just swallow it down. It was just short enough to get around the corner and down. Now this eel's head here is from an Australian eel weighing 22 pounds 10 ounces, a 2210 eel, and you can see that this twig would be probably just about able to swallow it down round the corner of its mouth. So it's suitable for eels up to 14 pound, this twig, which is fine in the UK. It will be 100% safe. But if you go to Australia after longfin eels that grow to over 20 pound, I'd recommend this much bigger twig, which is 150mm long. It's got a 5mm diameter, but again it's the length that's critical. You see, this eel wouldn't get it around the corner of its mouth to get it down its throat. The twig's too long. And same with the smaller twig for the UK eels. They can't swallow it down. So they'll get your bait in, but not the twig. Now then, this eel's head was a 22 pound 10 ounce eel, and there it is in the flesh. Pete Drabble caught this eel and it was deep hooked, unfortunately, but it swam off. After catching it, it swam away and we didn't see it again for several days. And then we were fishing this huge reservoir in Australia and suddenly an eel popped up from the bottom. We reckon it must have gone and crawled along the bottom after we'd captured and injured by the deep hooking, and then it had died, gassed up, and it popped up to the surface, and then the wind blew it right into our feet. So rather than waste such a fine specimen eel, I decided to cut its head off, stick the head on the fence, let the flies eat it down, and it's kind of become mummified now, and I brought it home with me. So I'm showing you this because it's bringing home why we need to lip hook eels. Such an incredible specimen as that. And how many eels must have died at the hands of eel anglers over the years? We thought that if you cut the trace and left the hook in and they swam off, they'd survive, but it seems that the hook can do internal damage to the organs and they die several days after capture. So be warned, you must lip hook your eels in future. Now, how I generally fish the twig is on a basic link ledger. The twig is attached to the trace, short link to a 4-ounce weight, and it's a resistance free running basic ledger, and we leave just a little bit of wiggle room here, up to 1/2 inch from the end of the twig to the eye of the hook, and I'll explain why shortly. Like I said, we leave a gap of no more than 1/2 inch between the twig and the eye of the hook, preferably less, leaving just a little bit of wiggle room. This distance has been calculated by a study of the eel's anatomy. Its main artery is just at the back of its throat, just there. And if that artery is severed, the eel will bleed to death. And that is very, very close to the corner of its mouth, which is why we have to have such a small distance between the twig and the eye of the hook, because we do have to take into account the length of the hook as well. And originally, when I started trialling the twig, I was leaving a 1.5 inch gap between the twig and the hook, but it was too long. Thanks to Clive Dennison for pointing that out. I went fishing with Clive, and he has done more for eel conservation than anybody in this country. He's a top bloke, Clive, and his knowledge of eels is incredible. So he put me right, and he pointed out you don't measure from the snout of the eel to the main artery as a 1.5 inches, because the eel takes the bait in and the line comes out of the corner of the mouth, which is much closer to the artery. So we had to reduce that distance to 1/2 inch, maximum of 1/2 inch. So thanks to Clive Dennison for pointing that out. Like I said, if the hook severes the artery, the eel will bleed to death. Now, to be honest, eels will still take the bait with the twig right up against the hook without leaving 1/2 inch and having no wiggle room for this hook at all. You can have it right up against the hook and eels will still take the bait. It's a matter of the angler feeling confident enough to stick at it. Worms will wrap themselves around the twig, the trace, and any surrounding vegetation or detritus, such as rotting leaves or wind-fallen twigs, which usually you can find wind-fallen twigs littering the bottom. It's quite a natural occurrence. The worms will cling on so that the eel will have to prise them free. This happens in nature too, where all the invertebrates that eels feed on have got either a hook, a claw, a sucker, a leg, or some similar mechanism with which to cling onto its surrounds, so that the eel will have to prise them free when it's feeding. As such, finding worms clinging to a twig must seem quite natural to the eel. Now, you can buy this clear acrylic rod online already cut to lengths. I bought mine already cut into 100mm lengths. Just put a Google search in and you'll soon find it. And to attach it, you can use rubber bands. My rubber bands, plastic ones, they come from an aquarium airline tube, the stuff you have from the pump to the airline, and freely available from aquarium shops. The twig can be used with any rig, whether you're float fishing, ledgering, bolt rig, semi-bolt rig, off-bottom Dyson rig. What you must remember is that one rig doesn't fit all situations, but the twig can be put on all rigs to make them 100% safe to the eel. Some rigs, semi-bolt rigs and bolt rigs and things, are 90% safe, but you will get the occasional mishap. And in my opinion, with this big twig, you will never deep-hook a single eel. It makes it 100% safe. So if you want to stay safe, use a twig. This is my version of the Dyson rig. The float pops up off the bottom. We've got a run ring here, pink bead, and a trace with the twig on. I'm just showing you this to show you that you can use the twig with the Dyson rig. I've used it with some very large and smaller live and dead baits. Well, dead baits actually. I don't use lives, I use deads. But you could use it with lives as well. And I'm just showing you this so you don't be shy and think you can't use a twig with a Dyson rig. Of course you can, and it will make it 100% safe to the eel. So there we are, an off-bottom rig with the twig on. Be prepared to bump off the odd fish when the hook pulls out due to being only lightly hooked. I must say though, most are firmly hooked in the bottom jaw when using the twig, but you do also get several that are just lightly hooked in the lips, and they do occasionally bump off. Also, I would have your scissors close at hand, as you're going to get in a bit of a pickle when you get some horrible net tangles with a huge eel rising in the net and the hook point protruding from the eel's lips. It catches in the net and it rolls up into a real horrible mess. You probably end up with the odd hole in your net, but it's all good stuff. It's in the cause of the safety of the eel. And what usually happens is that the hook just comes out in the net. There are going to be several variations of the twig in the future, I should imagine. The trace could be inside of a hollow 100mm rigid tube, or the twig could be made of buoyant reed stems or thin float stems or any buoyant material, so the trace will lift up in the water and pop the trace up, keeping the bait just off the bottom. The twig can be used with large baits as well. In one water I fished, the eels respond to a massive 5 to 7 inch bait whilst they ignore smaller baits. So when people tell me that you don't need to use big baits to catch big eels, I would say that every water's different, because I know a water where you have to use a big bait to catch. Now, although the eel can swallow such a large bait, they can't swallow the twig. As I said, it's rigid and too long to get around the angle of the eel's throat. So using the twig with a large bait, it's making your rig 100% safe to the eel. If you're not able to be right on top of the rods, and I'm not promoting lazy angling here, I'm just being realistic, perhaps you're making a call on nature or zipped up in the bivvy. With a twig on the trace, you can be assured that the eel will not be able to swallow the bait down before you get to the rod. Now here's my example of a semi-bolt rig. You can use this without the twig, which I have been doing, and I've managed to lip hook all my eels, but possibly at some point one will manage to swallow it, but so far so good. You can also have a twig on your trace to make it guaranteed 100% safe, but it's not a bad rig to use without the twig. So we've got a short link ledger, a very short trace, and 2 beads, one either side of our run ring. The run ring in this case is a big-eyed swivel, and then we have a stop knot to act as the bolt. So the eel has freedom of movement to pick the bait up. It's got no resistance at all, free play, and it feels quite safe. It moves away, and before it's had a chance to swallow it, the bolt kicks in and pricks the hook home into the eel's mouth. I use this rig all the time when I do fish for zander a lot when it's out winter, and when I'm dead baiting for zander I use this semi-bolt rig all the time with great effect. It's important that you have the hook point very sharp so it will trick the eel quite easily when the bolt kicks in. It's also important that you don't have any bait masking the point of the hook, so you can shove a bit of a rubber maggot on like this after you put the bait on to keep the point unmasked. You see that's pricking my finger there, and all the bait will be further down the hook. It's very, very effective rig, and the distance to set the stop will vary on the size of eels and the size of bait you're using, but generally you'd go for as smaller bait as you can really with this bolt rig, because it will just work more effectively with a small bait. And when I'm zander fishing I have the knot about 15 inches away from the trace, and for eels this is only 6 or 8 inches away, and that's enough to let the eel have a bit of freedom of movement, and then the bolt to prick the hook home before it's had a chance to swallow it. Now you can also substitute the 4-ounce lead with a swim feeder for the semi-bolt rig, and for any basic ledgering rig or any other rig that you fancy a swim feeder on. The important bit about the bolt rig is that you want a heavy weight, and the same when you link ledgering, free running link ledger, you want a heavy weight so that the line can go through without moving the weight along the bottom, which would spook the eel. So this was a 3-ounce feeder, and I've added some cow weights to it to make it up to 4 ounces so it will hold on the bottom. Now it's very good for when you're using tiny baits and a short hook length with your bait will be lying next to the swim feeder. I used to use large baits and I was confident that the eel would smell out the scent. I've been doing this for years, but I've changed my ways of eel fishing with the knowledge we've gained over the recent years, and now I use very small baits. Gone are the huge baits that I used to be so confident about, and I was so confident that the scent coming off the large massive bait would attract the eel. Now you have to remember that the freshwater eel has a greater sense of smell than any other species of fish apart from the great white shark. Think of the swim feeder as a rubby-dubby as used by shark anglers to lay a scent trail to attract sharks. The massive bait that I used to put on the hook can now be put in an armour mesh bag inside the swim feeder so that no food items will escape, just scent and flavour, which will attract the eels to the tiny hook bait lying beside the feeder. It's all about confidence really, and in my experience I find that if you're confident enough to leave a small bait in the water without a swim feeder, eels will sniff it out no matter how small the bait. And that concludes my piece on lip hook your eels. Thank you for listening, and now we'll go and get lunch.